Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming along for what is the second installment of this long-form tale of how the classics, whatever that means, became classic, whatever that means. Now, for those of you who weren't here last time, it was something of a whistle-stop tour across space and time. We covered, I believe, 3,500 BC to 500 BC, so 3 millennia, and we started over in Iraq, moved up through Mesopotamia, round the Fertile Crescent, through Syria to the Levant, down to Sinai, over to Egypt, back up to Phoenicia, into the Mediterranean with the spread of the alphabet, and that was the tale we told. Now, today is going to be a less complicated affair, but actually a more important episode in terms of building what the Western tradition of literature regards as the classical tradition. Now, I'm only going to be covering 1,000 years today, from roughly 500 BC to 500 AD, so simpler stuff. And I'm not going to be pinging around the map in some madcap way. I'm mostly going to be in the Mediterranean basin, in particular, for obvious reasons, in Greece, in Greek North Africa, specifically Alexandria, and in Rome, okay? So it'll be less dizzying, I hope, than last time. And it's a thrill to have come over from Cambridge again to one of these hearts of the Western civilization tradition. I don't mean the University of Oxford, of course, I mean the British pub, which has been one of the mainstays of the tradition. Okay, so I was rather fast and furious last time in terms of some of my definitions, and it may have surprised you that in a lecture called The Birth of Literature, which was the first lecture, I never defined literature, okay? We'll come to that problem in a moment, but before I get to that, I just want to sketch the 4 things that I will be setting out in this talk as necessary stages for how the classics could even get to the so-called medieval period, out of which the classics could be built. The last lecture was all about the sine qua non, the crucial elements of the birth of writing and indeed the birth of the alphabet. Without that, no hope. In terms of this lecture, I'm going to cover 4 smaller stages. They are the birth of the library. They are emergence of something called the scholarly community in a meaningful sense. Then there's the significance of Roman conquest of Greece, which is a major part of this tale. And then finally, there's something that I would call technological, even though it's not in bits and digits and computer terminology. I mean moving from the scroll or the roll to the codex, which looks like the modern book. That's a major part of the world we're in. And I would not hesitate to say that without that technological move from the scroll to the codex, this university would not exist. Okay, it's that important. Anyway, back to this big question. Now, I'm no philosopher, and I'm not going to bog you down with theory or with abstractions, but we do need to clarify what literature is. Now, I think we would all agree, whatever view you come into the room with, that literature has to be verbal, okay? A piece of art, be it a painting or a sculpture, it's certainly art, and we could even say it speaks to us metaphorically, but without words, I don't think anyone would classify pictorial art or plastic arts as literature. Fine, so it needs words. But does it then follow that any exchange of words is literary? I would put it to you, no. You may have entertaining conversations around your table, or you may, in your head, think not just random thoughts, but beautiful thoughts. And I love all of those, but I think you would be hard pushed to categorize either the casual conversation or your private thoughts as literature proper. However, it becomes controversial and difficult when we ask ourselves, does literature need to be written? The great majority of literature, indeed what we can actually find in a library, is written. So it may seem obvious that the answer is yes, but it's not obvious. There are many cultures around the world, including, as we heard last time, the ancient Greek culture before they got writing from the Phoenicians, which has a long and complex literary culture, which is purely oral. That is to say, carefully cultivated, performed and taught song, which follows various rules and formulae, which are certainly artistic. And the difficult question to set before you is it fair to say that oral song culture, or indeed any culture that isn't writing their song, their poetry, is not literary? Many would say that is not fair, David. I would say, okay. But I would also say that in order to get somewhere with this sense of literature, and for my tale to make sense, I'm going to go for a narrower definition of literature. What is that word? Literatura. It's something involving literae, letters. That is to say, it's not simply spoken, it's manifested and instantiated in a textual form. So, my first claim, and thankfully no one agrees on these definitions, so it's just for me to roll with, literature has to be written. Okay, the second question that instantly throws itself in my face is everything written literature? Now, this may seem a stupid question, but some people think it is. If it's got into letters, by whatever means, it's literature, right? Well, let's think of some examples. Clearly, someone attempting a work of literary art is going to be literary, irrespective of its merits. Fine. But what if we were to think of, say, someone on the phone saying, oh yes, you've got your insurance policy, and I'll send you the literature about it. And it arrives, you open it up, you're so excited about that literary moment, but it's just technical jargon about the terms and conditions. Is that literature? We were told it was, but I personally would struggle to categorize it. If we take it to an even more extreme position, would a shopping list, once written down, become literature? Few would say it would. Or, for instance, if we were to imagine the ingredients on a can of Coke, is that going to attain the status of literature? My second hard line is no. By literature, I mean not just anything written, but something written in a way that is self-conscious about its form, okay? It may not be attempting to be art, but it's aware that its written form adds up to more than the sum of the parts of what is written. Put differently, literature cannot just be descriptive. If I sat down and wrote about everything I saw in this room, by my definition, that is not literary. But if I were to try and interpret the room, however wrongly or bizarrely, that would fall into the context of literature. So, for everything that follows in these lectures, literature is to be understood as the attempt to put into writing something that is self-aware and adds up to more than the sum of its parts. It may be art, it may be historiography, it may be anything that's aspiring for something more than mere words. Okay, chaps, you've just come in. Do you want to find a seat, or do you want to sort of endurance stand? It's up to you. So as they file in, I'll just leave with you this problem of what is literature. I mean, a very pressing one at the moment, and one that is going to indeed have legal action and court cases behind it, is the question of whether AI can produce literature. There's no question at all that AI can produce literary works which to the untrained eye, or even the trained eye, have literary merit. Does that make them literature if there's no human intent behind it? I'm going to park that philosophical problem. Okay. So, with that as our working definition of literature, we can get back to our tale. We've got to 500 BC, we got ourselves to classical Athens, and I was saying how very rapidly different genres, different styles of literary product appeared rapidly. Not just epic in the Homeric tradition, not just drama, be it tragedy or comedy, but there was lyric poetry, there was oratory, rhetoric that was worth sharing with friends, philosophical dialogues of a literary kind, historiography, all sorts suddenly happened in the Greek world from the 700s BC. Now, there's two elements I'd like to focus on before we move the story on. And both highlight these same three features which are essential to how literature evolves. The first is that although it is written, as per my definition, it's nevertheless to be performed. And that means it's not restricted to those who can read and those who can write. It still has an oral element despite its textual manifestation. The second is that there's a competitive element. This is so crucial to understand, that rivalry and the ability to say X is better than Y as literary art is crucial to understanding the evolution of this particular world. And the third element is the judgment that comes out of that. If we grant, as the Greeks did, that X can be better than Y, well, who's in the position to make that judgment? And what follows once you've made that judgment? That is absolutely crucial, although it's not the whole story, for how Greek literature survives into the world as we know it. Okay, so very briefly, the first of these is just a snapshot of Homer. You can wander down the High and buy Homer's Iliad or Homer's Odyssey, and you think you're holding what that poem looked like. You are and you aren't. You aren't because it was performed 10,000, 100,000 times by individual touring bards and performers, and each of them had a different version. What we have is effectively one person's version, even though it's been fiddled with in complex ways over the years. And whether or not that person was Homer, whether or not the Iliad and the Odyssey are by the same person, doesn't matter. The fact remains, we only have a snapshot. Now that's weirder than you think, because let's take the Iliad, the Trojan War. It's 10 years of warfare, but the Iliad as we have it only covers 50 days, and it only describes the action of 9 days in a 10-year war. That's not an obvious thing to do, that's actually a perverse thing to do, but our Iliad does that. If we went out on the street and said, okay, what are the two big tales about the war in Troy? Average person's going to say, oh, well, you've got your Trojan horse sneaking in and causing chaos, and then Achilles is in it, and you've got Achilles' heel, you know, he'll get shot in the heel and die. Right. Two major mythological moments. Neither is in the poem. Okay? It's just not even there. The fall of Troy proper isn't really there. It's really just a very unusual and particular telling. Now, why do I go on about this, given that we spoke about Homer last time? Because the tale was told by the Greeks to themselves, so even if it's untrue, it was their folk tale as to the origin of Homer, that a tyrant of Athens, and in these days, tyrant doesn't necessarily mean authoritarian guy who says this is how it's got to be. It's just someone who gains power in a non-canonical dynastic form. Okay. Well, this chap Pisistratus in the 7th century BC, the 6th century BC, held a big festival called the Panathenea. And the idea was everyone comes to Athens, he shows off, there's all sorts of performances, including a competition of the best Homeric bard. But by this point, with writing, it was no good to have people come and freestyle. No. They had to perform from the official version, which Pisistratus is said to have made. And if you go down this rabbit hole, you find that the Iliad that we've got is weirdly interested in Athens. Athens was nothing in the days of the Trojan War, nothing at all. But in the Iliad we have, there's all these little hints like, yeah, Athens is pretty good. Lots of interesting stuff going on at Athens. Well, that's meaningless in the context of Bronze Age warfare, but is very important for a tyrant setting up the Athenian version of the drama. So that's public performance of a specific form of the epic in a competitive scenario. Let's leap across to the theatre now. Theatre, Greek theatron. What does that mean? It's the place where you theastai, where you watch. All it means is a place for spectacle. So it's a fundamentally visual medium, despite it being entirely spoken and sung. It's verbal, but to be enjoyed visually. So if we think of the great dramatic festival in Athens, the so-called city or Great Dionysia, it's a multi-day festival, and it's not like one of these, well-heeled literary festivals in a modern leafy suburb. No, this is full-scale, open to the public, everyone pile in, literary festival. And just to be clear about this, if you're a male citizen, the state will pay for you to have a ticket. If you're in prison, you will be released from prison so that you get yourself into the theatre and be part of it. Now, we may fairly say, okay, men. Men were the full citizens. What about women, children, and slaves? Well, we don't actually know, but there's good evidence that there was no restriction against all of those categories being melded into an audience of 5 or maybe 6,000. The big problem was that they weren't state subsidized for their ticket, so manifestly it would have been a harder affair for them to be there. So the reality is we have the whole of Athens falling into the theatre for a multi-day artistic competition. The tragedians put on 3 tragedies, bam, 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 and then as a sort of palate cleanser or amuse-bouche, they have a random, dirty sex comedy with these characters called satyrs, who are kind of woodland men with horses' legs, horses' ears, always erect phalluses, just causing chaos, okay? So each tragedian has his 3 proper tragic trilogy, and then this weird thing, okay? One on one day, one the other day, one the next day. Now, all of us, if we imagine we're Athenians, we come from one of 10 districts, and each of our district nominates people who are going to be a judge. On the day, one from each of those 10 is randomly chosen, and you sit on the front row, all 10 of you. And at the end of these performances, you write down who you think was best. But to stop this being a biased system where I, as a playwright, sort of give you backhanders, it's actually random which 5 of the 10 have their best choice picked. So if you're following, 10 random people picked from around Athens, choose the best play, and then 5 are picked, and I add up how many get the most vote. And that person wins the crown. That playwright is the major victor. Their name is inscribed, and they are celebrated far and wide. So my point, just to close with drama, is that although it's a very public, everyone can pile in whether you understand it or not, genre, it nevertheless has this sense that a judgment can be made about what's best. Okay, so a problem's going to emerge with both Homer and with these dramatic texts. Imagine you put on the greatest play we've ever seen. It's unbelievable. Everyone's raving about it. All the judges wrote the name of you. Well, what happens next? Can we keep putting on your play next year and next year? Not normally. But what about this person who wasn't able to attend? Is it just lost to history? No. For reasons we don't fully understand, either you as director, as playwright, had your own version, or you, sir, as the lead actor, you had your own actor's copy. Either way, you've got a physical written form. It's possible that Dan may be able to purchase a copy of your text, but he may not. So we've got to work from the other side of the coin here and say, how is it that the great playwrights, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, or the great comedians such as Aristophanes and Menander, how in their plays were they able to echo and sometimes parody exact lines from a play 50 years ago? The only answer is that there's a circulating book trade of these texts. Now, you may think, well, obviously there's a book trade. No, not obviously. The reality of how difficult it is to create a book, to make it, and we'll come briefly to that in a moment, to have someone who can write, and then write the whole of a text in a long papyrus roll, and then for you to have it, and for you to be able to read, that's a very small percentage of people. Fundamentally, you wouldn't get any money if someone buys a copy of your play. There's no copyright, there's no royalty, and so there's no real incentive for these things to get into circulation. Okay, so it becomes a problem when we get to the 4th century BC that the great plays are being put on again. But people can sense they're not quite right. The famous actors of the day are changing speeches to be twice as long, 3 times as long, and they're adding things in that they've made up. They're just freestyling so that they have a bigger share of time on the stage. We say they're interpolating their own material. Well, that's no good. Aeschylus and Sophocles don't want you throwing in their own your own material and then passing it off as if it's part of the original. So, just before we leave Athens, in the late 4th century, around 330 BC, another tyrant, they're always around, Lycurgus, says, guys, this isn't good enough. We need official copies, put in the library, put in the official state library, and those are the authoritative version. Any new performances, you've got to use this copy. Where did those come from? We don't know, but we imagine well-connected people, possibly descendants of the great playwrights, had their own versions. Okay, so we already have this problem of debasing a literary original. Quality control, how do you do it? Okay, we're going to go south from Greece now, and Greece really fades from view in the late 4th century because of a Macedonian called Alexander and styled the Great. Alexander the Great goes rogue, Macedon is conquered, he heads east, all the way through Asia Minor, round to Egypt, further east, through Iran, up to Turkmenistan, into India, before his soldiers effectively say, yeah, we're done, this is ridiculous. Alexander comes back, gets to Babylon, and dies. Okay. Why am I talking about Alexander? Well, of the 20-odd Alexandrias he founded, one was on that North African coast we mentioned last time. These lectures are under the aegis of Pharos, the great lighthouse next to Alexandria. And in Alexander's name, this new city was founded. Once Alexander died, all sorts of Macedonian generals fought over his ridiculously large empire, okay? And the Egyptian part, to use modern terminology, was ruled by the Ptolemies. Ptolemy. These are Macedonian Greeks, but they took control of what we now call Egypt. And for whatever reason, they thought the way we get cultural power is to create a library. Now again, libraries are a new thing in the Greek world, okay? Someone might have a private collection of books, but the idea that there's a public library where you as a citizen can come in and consult something, it's just not a thing. In other cultures, we mentioned the Assyrians and the Achaemenids. They had libraries in the sense of collections of text, but again, they were a closed shop for the royal elite or the priestly caste. They were really a private affair. Well, in Alexandria, two major things happen. Number one is this insane ambition to bring together the world's literature such as it could be grasped. The second, as an offshoot of that, is to create a public-facing library alongside it. So in brief, the Ptolemies set about getting every text in Greek they know of, arranging them in a library, and coming up with the idea of genres and categories and what goes where. They put all their effort into it. They confiscate any text that comes to Egypt, often making a copy, but they give you the copy because that will have the mistakes. A famous anecdote is told about these great tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, from the 3rd century BC. And the idea is that Lycurgus has got the great copy back in Athens of these plays. So the Ptolemies in Alexandria say, okay, we'll give you 15 talents on loan to borrow your copies and make our copies, okay? They do that. These copies are sent over to Egypt, and then the Ptolemies say, well, we'll just keep them now. You can keep your 15 talents, your half a ton of precious metal. We've got the real deal, so see you later, Athens. And this is actually a capture of the authoritative copies of the great Athenian playwrights, a big moment. Okay, I'll just have a sip. Now, here we are in Oxford. Oxford runs on a collegiate system where theoretically, it's only in theory, scholars come together and are paid to live as a community and possibly teach people, okay? They're engaged in research, again, in theory, and the idea is that this is a self-sustaining community that somehow heads somewhere in progress. Fine. Well, in Alexandria, the library is only part of a bigger thing called the Museion. Museion, the temple, the shrine of the Muses. Put Museion in Latin, it becomes Museum. which gives us the museum, got the Ashmolean across the way. Okay? Fundamentally, it's a devotion to the muses, but in practice that means all of the arts and sciences. Okay. So, from the 3rd century BC, this community employs scholars to live there. They pay no taxes. They can do whatever they want. They don't have to teach. The idea is they will just do good things in a research capacity. So it's a bit like All Souls in terms of a modern college analogy. They don't teach, they don't take the undergrads at All Souls. Okay, many big figures come through this institution, and I don't have time to talk about them. But it's worth saying 3 things about what happens within the Museion and within the library, because they change everything. The first is that judgments are made about what out of the whole of literature gathered together is worthy of serious study. That requires judgment, krisis, and someone who makes judgment is a kritikos, or a critic, okay? There's no escaping the fact that any critic has to make judgments. You can't say, oh, everything's perfectly good, all of these books are great. No, your job is to have decisions and judgments in the krisis, okay? So we get the first idea of a special group, hoi enkrithentes, the authors that have been chosen as in the in-group. Some don't get in, and it's only with that inclusion that we have a sense of select and not select. That sounds elite, and it literally is elite, because the word elite comes from Latin eligere, is to choose. You can only celebrate X if you've excluded Y. This is just a principle of any mode of criticism. Okay, so we start to get the emergence of a canon happening in Alexandria. That's the first thing. The second is that you've got to take seriously those authors, which means you've got to write scholarly commentaries. You've got to work out what text they actually wrote. And we start getting professional academic activity on those particular literary texts. And the third thing I hinted at earlier is the idea of the public having a stake in this. So although they couldn't go in the main library at Alexandria, they very much had a right to go to the daughter library called the Serapeum. And that was publicly open for people in Alexandria to come and enjoy it. Now, you may know that we have some surviving library buildings from the ancient world, most famously the Library of Celsus at Ephesus, an amazing building. What about the Library of Alexandria? Unfortunately, it's one of the great tragedies and indeed great mysteries that we don't know what happened to it. Tales are told. I mean, it's clear that, as with all beautiful things, the bureaucracy and the administrators will eventually ruin them. And already by the mid-2nd century BC, we have figures imposing themselves on the library, and the scholars leave. That happens in 145. 100 years later, Julius Caesar, the Julius Caesar, has fallen in with Cleopatra. And things get out of hand in the civil war, and he sets fire to the warehouses down by the docks, and we're told that that burned loads of the storage of the library's books. A few hundred years later, Aurelian in the 270s is trying to push out Queen Zenobia of Palmyra out of Egypt, and it seems as though the library was even more destroyed then. By the end of the 4th century, when Christianity is doing its thing, it seems that Emperor Theodosius even took out the Serapeum, and all the library has gone. We don't know where it was. We have no surviving scroll from it whatsoever. It's gone. Okay? Were there other libraries? Well, yes and no. More no, because this was such a dominant institution that other people around the Mediterranean didn't really give it a go. There's one exception to that, and that's up on the west coast of Turkey, as we'd now call it, in Pergamon. In Pergamon, there's a rival institution where the Attalids, a guy called Eumenes II, is like, we're going to rival Alexandria, we're going to do a better library. And they do give it a go. But fundamentally, it falls apart after about 100 years. It lives on, however, for reasons that will come around soon enough. So here we are. The Greek literary world has faded. The Library of Alexandria eventually is destroyed and its trace is lost. where do we go? The answer is we finally move across to Rome. And it's in Rome that things suddenly get interesting. I say suddenly because the first half a millennium of Roman culture has no literature. Half a millennium, 500 years, no literature. It seems impossible, right? Well, it seems to be the case. This canonical date, 753 BC, when little Romulus and Remus, after sucking on a wolf as you do, and killing one another as you may do, Rome is founded, okay? But we know that from 753 to 240, Rome was just not engaged in what I am calling literature. Instead, it falls to a different group I mentioned last time, the Etruscans, to keep this idea alive. Very briefly, when the dramatic scene died in Athens, troops of actors went on tour, not up to the Edinburgh Fringe, but around the Greek-speaking Mediterranean. And these actors of Dionysus put on plays, people came, and by all accounts, it was a big deal. They put on the classics, people went, it was fine. But it was the Etruscans who appear to have built things onto that tradition. And when, in 240 BC, Roman literature crops up, they're clearly drawing on the Etruscans. All their words for things like a stage, scene, scene, or a mask, persona, are taken from Etruscan. And just as a little aside, it amuses me as an etymology that the very word for a human individual, a person, comes from Latin persona, which means mask, which comes from the Etruscan perso, which means dramatic mask. So this idea of taking on a role, which is not you, has emerged somehow to mean actually you as a person. Anyway, so in 240 BC, a Greek-speaking slave puts on the first play. And everything in this period is Greek-infused. It's Greek mythology, translated into Latin, for an audience who probably can speak Greek and they know plenty about Greek myth. So in 240 BC, Achilles is put on, and soon after that, we've translated the Odyssey into Latin. Okay, I'm going to fast forward. I just wanted to underline that there's a half a millennium of literary silence before the Romans get going. Let's move into the 2nd century BC. And in 168, sorry to give you the dates, but if you're interested, 168, Rome fundamentally conquers Greece. And that could just be a simple tale of destruction. Nothing's lost in warfare, and it could have been just the end of that Greek literary tradition. But no, the Romans make a power play, such a cynical power play as well. What do? Not only do they bring all of the books of the great libraries that survive in Athens and Greece back to Rome, but they choose 1,000 people from Greek culture to come to Rome. And this is a cultural set of delegates who are effectively enslaved, regardless of their social standing. And in doing that, in dragging and dropping 1,000 cultural elites from the Greek world, that suddenly gets the ball moving in Rome, which had historically been very anti-Hellenic, very against the Greeks as a culture. And before we know it, we have all sorts of literary genres emulating the Greeks in Latin literature. Again, that's a big tale that I don't need to go into, but I do want to just give you a little quotation, a famous quotation from Horace. Horace was a celebrated lyric poet and effectively a protege of Emperor Augustus, the first of the emperors. And in the 10s BC, so at the height of the classical period, he writes, Graecia capta, ferum victorem cepit, in artes, intulit agresti latior, et in artes. That means Greece, though captured her fierce conqueror, and she, Greece, brought in the arts to rustic Latium, agresti latior. So what this means is the most polished, the most ingenious of Latin lyric poets is saying Greece always has the upper hand artistically, and although we conquered them, they actually conquered us because we can't escape the stranglehold, the embrace, in a more positive sense, of Greek literature. Okay, so that takes us really into the modern era, AD or CE, however you want to spin it. And there's a couple of points to make before we get to the final crux of my account. We've covered the origin of the library and the public library. We've covered the emergence of a scholarly community that takes literature seriously. We've come to Roman conquest, which brings those Greek attitudes into Rome. And finally, we're going to come to this idea of the role and codex. Before I get there, Roman libraries, what about them? They're late coming. Julius Caesar has an idea of creating the best library, but he dies. Things do not go well in 44 BC. And it's a private citizen, Pollio, Gaius Asinius Pollio, who creates in 39 BC the first public library. And he gives it a great name, the Atrium Libertatis, the Hall of Freedom. Why the Hall of Freedom? Because anyone, not just citizens, but anyone in Rome can attend, can take the scrolls off the shelf and engage with their shared culture. Okay, to round off the tale today, we've got these centuries of Roman rule to consider. Long story short, something happens in the 2nd century AD, 150s, 160s AD, where the literary spirit just sort of goes out of the Romans. And when we get into the 200s AD, it's political and social chaos. There's very little literature. By the time we get to the 300s, under Constantine, the Roman Empire has moved from pagan to Christian, and there's a new lease of life in Christian literature. But there's a sort of lack of energy, generally speaking, in those 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. Now, the reason why that matters is because we've got to think about the material reality of an ancient book. Now, this isn't going to be boring, I hope. It's going to be quite simple, but it's got unavoidable truths that cannot be escaped. So what I mean is that in the Greek world, in the Egyptian world, and in the Roman world at this time, a written book, once in circulation, has to be on a scroll. That scroll has got to be made of papyrus from that reed plant, mostly grown in the Nile Delta, crisscrossed like this into a square. You glue the squares together, you get an 8 or 10 meter length, and you write in columns like this, okay? Fundamentally, that means when you read, you're holding 2 rollers and you scroll along like this. It takes forever. At the end of it, like an old VHS, someone will have had to rewind all the way back, and that's really book technology. That means you can't write a long text. You've actually got to make loads of scrolls. So if we take a work like Herodotus, the so-called father of history, as we mentioned last time, we would say that's one book, it's the Histories. But no, it's 9 books, because you can't fit any more in a scroll, otherwise the scroll falls apart, okay? Also, you can only write on one side of the scroll, so it's a very unwieldy material. But the crucial thing is this: we're in Europe. We're in rainy, windswept Europe, and papyrus cannot survive for more than 200 or 300 years. It just won't do it. It will organically decompose if it doesn't set on fire or fall into the water or whatever. So papyrus scrolls can't survive from the ancient world. Now you may be thinking, well, hang on, we do have papyrus fragments. Indeed, there's loads over there, if they're still there. And the reason is one of 2 hacks or shortcuts to the fact that papyrus gets destroyed. Number 1, a way of surviving as a papyrus scroll is to get buried in sand where there's no water and there's no oxygen. You're just trapped in sand, i.e., you're in a rubbish chip or something like that in the North African desert. Good work if you can get it, but the fact will mean you're in a rubbish chip, you're going to be ripped apart and scrappy, and you're just going to be a little bit. Those survive. We've got thousands and thousands and thousands of those, but all tiny. Or, and this is the nuclear option, you let a volcano emerge and erupt over you, okay? It's a sort of trial by fire, but in so doing, you are carbonized as an organic scroll, And by virtue of being carbonized, you can survive. So I'm talking, of course, about the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD in the Bay of Naples, and that burning ash landing on a private library at Herculaneum. And we have some 2,000 books, by which I mean individual scrolls, carbonized by that process. In the 18th century, when we found them, we thought there's no chance that we can read them. People opened them, cracked apart, turned to ash. Bugger. Okay? However, technology moved on, and until about 20 years ago, we felt we could read some of them. Bizarrely, outside the world of classics in the last few weeks, a major breakthrough has happened, and there's a good chance we'll be able to read all of these. And it looks as though they're not just technical philosophy, there's going to be literature there too. So, papyrus can survive if it's buried under a desert, or it's carbonized in some aggressive moment. But if not, it's gone. So here's the last thing I'll say in today's narrative. How is it? Sorry?
What is the technology?
We'll talk about that in a moment. Yeah. So, how is it then that the great majority of books that we have surviving from the ancient world have survived in full? How can we read Homer, Hesiod, Aeschylus, whatever? The answer is this technological breakthrough, which I'll discuss briefly now. A papyrus scroll will fall apart. If you decide instead to make a book where you sew together leaves, it will still fall apart. But if you've moved from a scroll to a leaf-by-leaf book form, you can change the material. And this is what I mean about what was going on in Pergamum. They weren't sent papyrus because the Alexandria boys didn't want Pergamum to take off. No papyrus. So instead, they found a way of preparing animal skin, vellum, to create their own books. And it so happens that animal skin can survive for thousands of years if treated right. Because a book can be of whatever size and whatever scale, you can now use this material for your leaves. And we call it parchment. Why do we call it parchment? Because of French parchement, from Latin pergamenus, Italian pergamena, the Pergamum material. So although their library went, the breakthrough was using animal skin instead of papyrus. So why would people want to write in books of that kind instead of the scroll? 5 reasons. Haven't thought of them, but they'll come to me. Number 1, if you've got a scroll, it's very hard to find the place you want. You can't have rapid consultation. Not going to happen. Number 2, the columns are really close to each other, so you don't really have margins to make notes if you wanted to do that properly. Number 3, as I said, you can only get a certain amount in a scroll without it becoming unwieldy. In a single codex, which is what we call this book form, you can get 10 books, 100 books, the whole of the Bible, New and Old Testament, can fit in one book. Number 4, it only takes one hand to read. You can have it here, flick and write elsewhere, rather than this laborious instance. And number 5, you could use the beginning or the end to have index and contents with numbered pages, okay? So fundamentally, it gives you a completely new way into how to access literature. It's like Google, if you think about the technological breakthrough of being able to access material quickly once you know what to look for. Final 2 things before I'll let you ask any questions if you like. The first is that the Christians have a major role here. It seems as though no one cared about codex formats in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. We'll just stick with our scroll, thanks. But for a religion based upon scripture, where the exact word of God, be it in Greek or Hebrew translated into Greek with the Septuagint at Alexandria as it happens, you need to know the verba ipsissima, the very words that were said. So you need quick consultation, and you may well want to be making annotations as you go. So we know that the Christians were really into the format. The second thing, and this is the crucial bottleneck for the survival of literature. Papyrus is quite expensive. Treated animal skin is unbelievably expensive. And if I've got a big book, I'm sorry if you don't like to hear this, I probably need between 70 and 100 animal skins to make that one book. That's unbelievably expensive and laborious, and therefore it's an extremely elite thing. So we've got one of these paradoxes again, where the step forward of a new technology that will allow literature to survive to our day has a step backwards of making it a much narrower and more elite culture to be able to create a book. So the final thing that I hope makes this all make sense is that when we get to the 300s, decisions are being made in Rome and elsewhere in the Roman Empire as to whether you, as a private citizen, are going to take your tatty papyrus scroll of that poet you love and spend a decent amount of money to put it into an animal skin codex. If you don't, and if no one else does because no one wants to read that poet anymore, they're gone. They're literally not coming back because that scroll will die in the next few hundred years. If, however, just one person makes that transition from papyrus scroll to parchment codex and it survives the fall of Rome in 476, then that very book can be read today. Our oldest books are from the 4th and 5th century AD, and they are just as they were when they were created. So, the next lecture will take that story from the fall of Rome, when these decisions have been made about what is worth keeping and what isn't, and that's largely a private decision, and we'll take the story through the emergence of the monastery, the birth of the university, and then the rebirth of classicism in the Renaissance. So it'll be 500-ish to 1500-ish if you're able to join me then. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.